Civil rights movement did not use the same strategies as the trans movement. They didn't barricade speakers when they disagreed in a classroom for 3 hours. They persuaded through nonviolence and showing America their humanity. It's kind of funny because like this take is not all that different than what they have said in the past. If you like really listen to what TYT says all the time, like it's the classic like, well, MLK was nonviolent, whereas Malcolm X was like not the best. Even though Cenk does concede and say that which by the way is ahistorical, but Cenk does concede and say that there's two sides to this coin. And that without Malcolm X, MLK doesn't work on his own. You know what I mean? So he does recognize that. It is pretty funny. I don't know who the fuck got barricaded for 3 hours. I don't even know what this is.
So this is something I've been thinking about too. Does there need to be a violent element for a political cause to work? And I don't think or a civil rights cause. And I think the answer is basically no. I I know some people say that like, oh, well, we're gonna have like the super hardcore like Nazi tyrant people on one side, and then we're gonna have like a nice group of people over here, and then people will be like, oh, well, you know what? Let's just give the nice people what they want so the Nazis don't come in and do bad things. It's like, okay, but the violent people don't do bad things, right? But I think that that's not true. I think that the violent, I think there have been studies on this actually that show vote declines. We could look this up. Vote declines. Ugh, let's do our research. Let's not just spread fake news. All right. Places with civil rights riots and voting patterns. Oh, hang on. Riots and electoral outcomes during or after civil rights. New York Magazine? Okay. Okay, here's this. Okay, JS Store. The persistent effects of U.S. civil rights protests on political attitudes. Abstract. Protests can engender significant institutional change. Can protests also continue to shape a nation's contemporary politics outside of formalized channels? I argue that social movements can not only beget institutional change, but also long-run attitudinal change. Using the case of the civil rights movement, I developed a theory in which protests can shift attitudes and these attitudes can persist. From over 150,000 survey respondents provide Data from over 150,000 survey respondents provide evidence consistent with the theory. Whites from counties that experienced historical civil rights protests are more likely to identify as Democrats and support affirmative action, and less likely to harbor racial resentments against blacks. These individual level results are politically meaningful. Counties that experienced civil rights protests are associated with greater Democratic vote shares even today. The study highlights how social movements have persistent impacts. Okay, so it doesn't say violent or peaceful, it just says protests. So protests equal more people being more tolerant. But I'm pretty sure there is a study that shows that if the protests are overwhelmingly violent or violent, then there was actually a backlash in areas with riots. They actually voted for Nixon. For a possible analogy to the current nationwide explosion of unrest in response to the killing of George Floyd, you have to go back to the 1960s, particularly to the long hot summer of 1967, when civil unrest occurred in 150 cities, most violently in Detroit and Newark. and the National Guard was called out in 34 states, and then the sometimes violent protests in 1968 in more than 100 locations, the most destructive occurring in Chicago and Washington. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., these large wave of riots were preceded by the spectacularly destructive Watts riot of 1965 in Los Angeles and smaller but intense 1964 uprisings in Harlem, Rochester, and Philadelphia. Yeah, but what electoral impact did this have? Another notable phenomenon in American society could be nicely bookended by 1964 and 1968, a radical decline in support for the Democratic Party, which was the national political party associated with the interests of African Americans. Let's see the source on that. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson and running mate Hubert Humphrey won 61.1% of the vote of the national popular vote. In 1968, Humphrey won 42.7%, the lowest percentage of the vote won by a major party nominee since Alf Landon, FDR's victim in 1936. This dive in support, which continued through the 1972 presidential election, cannot be attributed directly or exclusively to white reaction to black riots. The Deep South's long developing alienation from Democrats was clearly more the product of peaceful protests, successful civil rights legislation, and court decisions, and was offset partly by the steady enfranchisement of African Americans following the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But in other parts of the country where white people were used to viewing civil rights as a drama confined to the South, riots were a shock to the political system. So this analysis shows that in the Deep South, the backlash would have likely happened either way, but that in the North or in areas that didn't have segregation, it might not. But what are they? I don't know what they base this all off of. I want to see they have a study that they link to. And while many other disturbing things were occurring during those years, most notably the rapid expansion of the Vietnam War, the sights and sounds of inner cities becoming war zones, with helmeted white cops and National Guard troops battling black protesters amid burning buildings and looted shops, were indelible images of the era. Without question, the regular white Democratic voters were frightened or infuriated by all this chaos and began listening to conservative law and order politicians like Richard Nixon and his running mate Spiro Agnew. Okay, but I want to see what they base this off of. New study shows American rights make about let's see the actual study. Okay, I think this is it. What? Agenda seating. How 1960s black protests moved elites, public opinion, and voting. Omar Wasow, Princeton University. Let's just go down to conclusion for now. Actually, let's go through this. The United States in the 1960s and early 1970s offers a useful context in which to test competing elite and pluralistic models of public opinion and policymaking. In that period, racial attitudes shifted dramatically on a range of issues. At the same time, grassroots activists mobilized at a scale rarely seen before, and elite political actors pushed for both landmark civil rights legislation as well as new forms of social control, using a range of methods. I exploit fine-grained temporal and geographic variation in black-led protest activity to estimate effects on media and politics, examining the relationship between protest activity and news coverage, congressional speech, public opinion, and county-level voting patterns. I find results consistent with the hypothesis that black-led protests during the 1960s are independently influenced in media, elite discourse, mass white attitudes, and voting behavior. Further, I find that the types of protest tactics employed produce distinct reactions. Nonviolent black-led protests played a critical role in tilting the national political agenda towards civil rights and black-led resistance. That included protester-initiated violence. Contributed to outcomes directly in opposition to the policy preferences of the protesters. This analysis improves upon existing literature in two ways. In a number of ways. First, in the 1960s, important variation in public opinion, news coverage, elite discourse, and voting, particularly about social control, is poorly explained by both elite-oriented and protest-focused theories of politics. I show that a focus on non-elite activists, in conjunction with their choices of tactics, better explains much of this variation. Second, among the most important choices made by activists is whether to adopt nonviolent or violent methods of resistance. Most prior work in American politics, however, has investigated effects of nonviolent or violent protest movements either in isolation or in combination without drawing meaningful distinctions between the two categories. In line with work in comparative politics and sociology, this study contrasts effects of protester-initiated tactics with particular attention to the multiple ways violence influences media coverage and voting behavior. Third, the mechanisms by which subordinated groups might influence political communication are often hypothesized without being directly tested. Lohman, 1993, for example, presents a game theoretic signaling model in which mass political action conveys information to political leaders, but the signal is communicated without any reference to media. I show empirically that disruption seeds mainstream news agendas, and that tactics influence the types of issue frames adopted by media. Fourth, most prior literature aggregates data by year and state or country, obscuring substantial within year and within region variation. I use day, week, and month level time series and county level geographical units to better identify causal effects of subordinate group protests, and movements. Finally, endogeneity is an issue of much prior literature. I apply Granger causality tests. Hang on a second, what the hell is that? The Granger causality test is a statistical hypothesis test for determining whether one time series is useful in forecasting another. First proposed in 1969, ordinarily regressions reflect mere correlations, but Clive Granger argued that causality in economics could be tested for by measuring the ability to predict the future values of a time series using prior values of another time series. Since the question of true causality is deeply philosophical, and because of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, after because fuck, dude, oh my god, ah, after this, therefore because of this. Okay, hey, I was a little close. Fallacy, assuming that one thing preceding another can be used. Yeah, this is how most people actually like kind of like view the world. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Like most people like you have all these analysts and pundits who are like, "Oh, well why did this candidate lose? Why did Howard Dean lose the Democratic primary?" Well, it was after his scream, so therefore his scream caused him to lose. The Dean scream. Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, people want to explain the world, and we aren't really good at doing that. And usually there aren't like high level studies showing why X, Y, or Z thing happened. Like at least not for years later, until years later. So people just sort of come up with explanations that kind of make sense, and maybe that's true, and maybe it's not, or maybe it's one factor among 10,000 other factors, and any one of them could change the outcome of an election. Such as, for instance, the one thing that Democrats like to say is that the Comey letter or the Comey statement made Hillary Clinton lose, which we don't actually know if that's true. Like, could it have happened? Maybe. Like, did that sway enough of the 10,000 people that she needed in like these Midwestern states? Maybe. Or maybe people just assume that because that thing happened before she lost, and therefore because of that. I apply Granger causality tests. A panel. You know, I'm still not sure I fully understand what this Granger thing is, and I want to actually understand that. So the time series. When time series X when time series X Granger causes time series Y, the patterns in X are approximately repeated in Y after some time lag. Two examples are indicated with arrows. Thus, past values of X can be used for the prediction of future values in Y. Okay. So it's basically just taking two different graphs that have two different events and then studying that, I presume, in depth, where, okay, has this pattern been repeated in the other series? So there's a jump here. Does that jump show up here? Okay, maybe that's a coincidence, but if you see that every single time or over and over, maybe it's indicative of something. That's sort of how I read it. Or at least there's a very high correlation that indicates there might be something there to the correlation. Or maybe not. Maybe there's other factors that aren't being accounted for, right? That go along with these events, but that people don't recognize, or that we're not properly controlled for. I apply Granger causality tests, a panel design with county fixed effects, placebo tests, and rainfall as instrument for violent protest activity to plausibly identify causal effects of subordinate group mobilizations. What explains temporal and geographic variation on issues of race in the 1960s? Okay. Figure 1 presents data on what Americans, when surveyed, indicate was the quote unquote most important problem facing the country between 1950 and 1980. Looking at issues of race, two trends are noteworthy. First, from 1950 into the early 1960s, the percentage of Americans responding that civil rights was the most important problem remained low. In the early 1960s, however, it spiked from approximately 5% in December 1962 to 48% in mid 1963, and then faded as damn, that's actually pretty high. Then faded almost as quickly. Second up, until the mid to late 1960s, concerns about social control as the most important problem remained in the single digits and then gripped the country to reach an initial peak of about 41% of respondents in August 1967 before declining rapidly after 1971. The rapidly shifting attitudes observed in polls were also evident in swings in white voting behavior. Civil rights goes up, reaches a crescendo in what 1963. I think that's what it said. Yeah, and goes down. Where's social control at? Nothing, nothing, nothing. That in and of itself is not indicative necessarily that the violent riots were the cause, though. So let's see what else they bring up. In 1964, Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater promised law and order against crime in the streets, but lost in a blowout to President Johnson, a champion of civil rights. By 1968, though the tide had turned and Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon successfully marshaled a tough on crime campaign to help win the White House, law and order rhetoric had been popular in the South for decades. It was not until the mid 1960s, however, that the slogan took root outside of the old Confederacy. In 1966, for example, Ronald Reagan echoed Goldwater and ran on Law and Order to win the California gubernatorial race. In short, the 1960s saw rapid temporal and geographic variation in white concern for race-related policy, first with civil rights and later with the rise of national coalition championing tough on crime policies. We don't need to get into those other theories real quick or agenda seating. That's not really the main. Like, this is interesting stuff, but I am on a stream right now, so okay. My goal is to estimate a causal effect of protests on voting, with attention to possible differential effects by tactic type. In addition, I aim to understand a plausible mechanism via media coverage. I began the analysis by using three statistical methods to test for a relationship between disruption strategies and the ultimate outcome of interest voting behavior. First, with county level data, I use panel models with county fixed effects to control for any time invariant characteristics. In addition, to address potential spatial correlation errors, I run potential spatial correlation of errors. What's spatial correlation? Spatial correlation means that there is a correlation between the received average signal gain and the angle of arrival of the signal. Rich multipath propagation decreases spatial correlation by spreading the signal such that multipath components are received from many different spatial directions. Oh, hang on, this is not in academia. Hang on, what? Oh, I spelled it wrong. I just want them to give me a definition. Spatial analysis fit each district's performance to its geographic location. Okay, so it's basically just using space, i.e. location, right? Spatial, okay. Now I lost my spot. Empirical strategy. Let's just go here. I run spatial models. Sorry, in order. Sorry. Okay. In addition to address potential spatial correlation of errors, I run spatial panel models that control for characteristics of neighboring counties. Second, to address heterogeneity of units, I use various matching and weighting techniques to approximate treated and control groups that are similar on all observed covariates, though may still differ for unobserved covariates. Third, to further address endogeneity, the property of being influenced within a system. I use rainfall in April 1968 as an instrumental variable that approximates random assignment of violent protests. Finally, to assess whether the estimated shifts in voting mattered in electoral politics, I run a counterfactual simulation of the 1968. Dude, if this is assuming these models are actually good and the data is good, like fuck. Okay. I mean this this basically, if this is true, which I'm going to try and find evidence that it's wrong too, then this left-wing argument is just complete trash. Like they should stop using it immediately if this is if this is all accurate. The agenda seating model makes specific predictions about the effects of subordinate groups protests on dominant group voting behavior. Aggregate measures of county level demographics and voting may not accurately reflect the individual behavior of white voters. Consequently, I conduct a variety of homogeneous place and placebo tests. The hypersegregation of Americans by race offers one solution to the ecological inference problem through a form of extreme case analysis. By limiting some statistical analysis to counties that are 90% white, county level data on Democratic vote share serve as as reasonably good estimates of individual level white voting behavior. To test the mechanisms by which protests are influencing politics, I again use multiple methods. First, I present plots to show the punctuated patterns of protest activity corresponding closely to changes in front page news coverage, elite discourse, and public opinion. I also present results from Granger causality tests that estimate whether trends in protest activity, front page news coverage, congressional speech, and public opinion are able to forecast one another. As a further test of agenda seating, I show that violence by activists, even when controlling for violence by police, increases coverage and prominence in the New York Times. So violence is good at getting you covered in the news. In addition, I show that protest tactics influence the language and frames employed by reporters, again, even when accounting for state violence. Across all tests, I show differential effects by disruption tactic. Though the model predicts protests influence politics through news coverage, I do not use a mediation model, as I lack county level measures of news in the 1960s. Table 2 presents an overview of the questions, methods, and data. Main findings are presented below in coefficient plots or figures. Regression tables and additional robustness checks appear in the appendix. Okay. Do protests sway voters? Protest equal voting? Protest election? Do activists lead or follow? Do tactics shape coverage? Issue framing, text analysis. Okay. Data and variables of interest. Wait, how much longer is this? I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Let's just go through some of the highlights here on the data. Like we can go through it all later if you guys want to, but this is a lot. So all counties, change in Democratic vote share, and this is positive change. Each point represents a coefficient along with the 90% and 95% confidence interval. For the estimated effect of protests on change in county level Democratic vote share in the presidential elections of 1964, 1968, and 1972, with county fixed effects, models using DCA data measure protest activity using participants with Carter data, arrests, other specifications seen. Okay. Okay, so positively correlated with an improvement in Democratic vote share, negatively correlated. All counties, nonviolent protests. Nonviolent protests are associated with a positive increase in Democratic vote share in all counties and in counties that are 90% white. What does the matched mean? The OLS matched weighted and second stage variable models all take the form of, okay, violent protests, DCA data, okay, so depending on which data set you look at, violent protests either have a moderate impact, moderate but sizable impact on voting patterns, or if you look at this other data set, the Carter data set, it has a severely negative. So either violent protests are somewhat negative or extremely negative, depending on which data set you look at. Okay. Public opinion about civil rights, headlines with civil rights, nonviolent protest participants. Oh, that's a whole other topic, but that's interesting. All right. Anyway, actually, what's the name of this author? Can you not undo the closed tear history? Is wrong about riots. Is this like the only guy who studied this? Are we really basing all of our political discourse on this on like one fucking study? Or there's no studies that show the opposite, are there? Because I'm pretty sure like there have been studies on violence before that probably indicate that it results in I mean, there's obviously case studies on it, but I don't know about like detailed analyses other than this one. But I see no articles or studies showing the opposite. So I'm not sure why. I guess the left just adopted this view because it's convenient for them to adopt. Sorry, Hassan, but you're gonna say stuff like maybe you should like look it up a little bit.
The irony is that like yeah, all kinds of
How
political
caveated was his claim?
past, if you like really listen to what DYT says all the time, like it's the classic like, well, MLK was nonviolent, whereas Malcolm X was like not the best. Even though Cenk does concede and say that which by the way is ahistorical, but Cenk does concede and say that there's two sides to this coin, and that without Malcolm X, MLK doesn't work on his own. You know what I mean? So he does recognize that. It is pretty funny. I don't know who the fuck got.
I mean, if he recognizes it, doesn't seem to be based in evidence. And we also have, of course, the example of gay rights, which we got without having to resort to violence pretty much at all. Like that was one of like the most peaceful movements probably in human history, and extremely successful in a very short time span. Would be a counterexample too.